Welcome once again to our introductory series on the divine principle. I'm Reverend Philip Shanker. In our first presentation, The Principle of Creation, we looked at the laws and principles that govern the operation of the physical universe, and from there could understand something about the nature and the purpose of its creator, the first cause, whom we call God. We also discussed the purpose and value of human life to realize the three blessings given to our first human ancestors: be fruitful or individually mature, multiply or create a God-centered family, and have dominion, loving dominion over the natural world. We talked about man's eternal purpose, that we live in two worlds, spiritual and physical, and that ultimately we have a portion of responsibility to cooperate with God in realizing His will and purpose in our lives. At the same time, we acknowledged that human beings have a contradiction, and that the world of our reality is vastly different than the world of our dreams. We're going to discuss today that contradiction as we look at the human fall. Let's begin. As we discuss this lecture series, you will see that along the bottom of the screen are the literal words taken directly from the divine principle, amplified by diagrams, and I will offer explanation and background for some of the major points. Anthropologist Richard Heinberg studied the creation myths and stories of the world's great civilizations. And Heinberg, in his book, The Memories and Visions of Paradise, noted, people in every culture and age have insisted that human nature is not natural at all because it's been distorted by some fundamental mistake or failure that's been perpetuated from generation to generation. Let's discuss the human fall. All people have an original mind which inclines them to pursue goodness, as we discussed in our introduction. Our conscience and original nature wants to be and to do good. And yet, even without our being aware of it, we are driven by evil forces to perform evil deeds which we do not want to do. We have a contradiction within ourselves, and every single one of us has experienced this struggle within, knowing we should do something, but not having the strength or willpower to act according to what our conscience tells us. Or conversely, knowing that we shouldn't engage in some behavior, yet when no one is looking, we can't resist the temptation or desire to act upon that. Now, in Christianity, the master of these evil forces is known as Satan. Until now, however, we haven't been able to overcome, and we've been unable to liquidate the forces of Satan because we've not understood Satan's identity or how he came to exist. This explanation of the human fall will address all of these concerns and clarify these issues. First, let's consider the root of sin. No one has clearly understood the root of sin, which lies deep within, driving us toward the way of evil, fueling that contradiction and conflict within ourselves. Now, on the basis of the biblical explanation, many have held to a rather vague belief that Adam and Eve's eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is, in fact, the root of sin. Let's consider the meaning of that fruit and the tree it grew upon, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree standing next to it, the tree of life. Many have thought that the fruit was that of an actual tree, but would God, a loving parent, place a dangerous fruit that could cause death to his children in their vicinity, in their innocence? Jesus said in Matthew 15:11, "Not that which goes into the mouth defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth, because it proceeds from the heart." In other words, it's not what we eat that can defile us, but what comes from our heart, Please remember that point as we continue. Now, the result of eating that fruit is that original sin has been passed on from generation to generation throughout the history of mankind. But how is it that what someone would eat could impact later generations? It doesn't make sense. Now, many have concluded that simply the act of eating the fruit or the temptation set there was a test established by God. But would an all-knowing God need to test, a God who knew their hearts, would he need to test them to see what they would do? And would a loving God impose a test on innocent children and impose a punishment of death? In the day you eat of that fruit, you will surely die. That would be like a parent, myself or yourself, putting a tasty piece of chocolate cake in front of our children, saying, I've got to go to the store for some milk. You sit next to the cake, smell it, but don't eat it. And then sneaking away just to see if our children would disobey us. And if they disobeyed, the punishment would be, boom, death. It doesn't make sense. James 1:13 says, let no man say when he is tempted that I was tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted, and he himself tempts no one. James explained, temptation begins when we are lured and enticed by what? By our own desire. And desire, when it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Now, that fruit, even as placed in front of them, was something they so ardently desired that they were willing to risk their lives to obtain it. What is it that a human being would desire so strongly that he would risk even death to obtain? We have to look more deeply. Remember, James said, desire gives birth to sin. Sin brings forth death. The fruit caused them to violate God's commandment, and they died. In order to understand the meaning of this fruit, we have to look deeper. Now, why should we stubbornly adhere to a literal interpretation of the fruit when so much of the Bible makes use of symbolism and metaphor? Look at the most important truths of the Bible. They're conveyed symbolically. For example, the words of Jesus. Now, in Mark 4:24, it says that Jesus never spoke to the public without using a parable. That's Mark 4:34. He never spoke without using a parable. Why? You and I would say the parables were to illustrate and convey the meaning of his teaching. But in Matthew 13, his disciples asked him, and Jesus said, I speak in parables so that some hearing will not understand. Now why? Why would Jesus desire that some people would not understand his message? Why would he speak in code or indirectly? Well, the answer is not difficult to understand. In Matthew 7, Jesus said, don't give pearls to swine or holy things to dogs, for they'll trample them underfoot and turn around and bite you. In other words, precious and profound truths should not be given to those who don't have the foundation to receive them or who merely want to use them against you. And so Jesus spoke in a kind of code through symbols so that those who had the foundation to understand could catch his meaning, while everyone else thought he was talking about fruits and farmers and seeds and sowers. The book of Revelation, which talks about the end of the world, how history will end, is filled with symbols. 7-headed beasts with 10 horns on their head coming out of the sea. Angels coming out from the rising of the sun. Cities descending. Blood flowing. All kinds. Horsemen riding. All of these are not literal but symbolic and have a deeper meaning. So, the cause of evil, the root of sin, isn't it one of the most important teachings in the Bible? If we consider it literally, what can that story teach us other than don't take fruit from strangers or never trust a talking snake? But looking deeper at its symbolic meaning, we can understand some profound truths. To learn what the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil represents, let us first investigate the tree of life, which stood next to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. See, the tree of knowledge of good and evil is mentioned only once, only in that story in Genesis. But its companion, the only two trees named and symbolized, the tree of life, is mentioned all throughout the Bible. In what capacity? In the Old Testament, it is set up as the goal and the ideal of people of faith. Proverbs 13:12. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but desire fulfilled is a tree of life. In the New Testament, Christians are pointed toward the attainment of the tree of life. Revelation 22:14. Blessed are those who wash their robes, for they shall have the right to the tree of life and can enter the city by its gates. Now, washing one's robes, again, is not literal. It's not doing our laundry. It represents cleansing and purifying. And in Revelation 3, Jesus promises that the victorious believer will regain access to the tree of life. So what is this tree that fallen people have longed for and sought after all throughout history? Well, we can recognize that since the ultimate hope of humankind is the tree of life, we can infer that Adam's hope was also the tree of life. In fact, Genesis 3:24 says that the access that Adam had to the tree of life prior to the fall was blocked, was lost to him. He lost access by the fall. An angel with a flaming sword, a cherubim, was guarding the way to the tree of life. Now, as we'll learn in later discussions, the sword, like the sword that comes from the mouth of the Lord, and flames, like the fire that Jesus came to cast on the earth, are symbolic of the truth. So what is this tree of life that Adam had access to, lost by falling, has been sought after by men and women of faith throughout history, is attained by victorious believers, and then also ultimately we must go through the truth in order to reach it? We consider what was the hope of Adam during the time he was immature and growing toward perfection. Was it money, power, or earthly gain? It wouldn't have been that, because he had all things set before him. Adam's longing, he must have hoped to become a man who would realize God's ideal of creation by growing to perfection without falling. Adam's desire was to fulfill his purpose in life, his future, his goal, his career, his life and experience in the world. That's what he was aimed at, and that's what the tree of life represents. Let's consider that the symbol used for the first blessing to Adam and Eve is that of a tree. Be fruitful, like a tree grows to fully mature with the bearing of fruit. Likewise, the tree of life is continually used as that kind of symbol throughout the Psalms. In the first Psalm, blessed is the man who walks in the ways of God. He is like a fruit-bearing tree, and he will bear much fruit. Also, Jeremiah 17 says, a righteous man who believes in the Lord has a deep root and will bear fruit, but a wicked man has no root and will not bear fruit. Likewise, in the New Testament, Jesus said, I am the vine, and you are the branches. If you abide in me, he who abides in me, he it is who will bear much fruit. Therefore, we can understand that the tree of life, in fact, symbolizes a man who has fully realized the ideal of creation. Perfected Adam was to be that ideal man. It thus symbolizes perfect Adam, a man of life, a fruitful tree, a fruitful man, a tree of life, a man of life. Now, let's consider the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and its significance. God did not create Adam to be alone. He also created Eve to be Adam's spouse. Just as there was a tree in the Garden of Eden which symbolized a perfected man, there also should have been a tree which represented a woman. This is the significance of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The only two trees mentioned in the Bible and given a symbolic name of life or knowledge are these two trees standing in the center. This represents the ideal of human beings to become true and perfected people. Excuse me. These two trees standing in the center are clearly symbolic. You will never find them in a botanical garden. You will never see them discussed in a book on horticulture. They are symbolic and represent the ideal and goal of the first human ancestors. Now, let's consider the identity of the serpent, another significant element in this story. In the Bible, we read that a serpent tempted Eve to commit sin, what does the serpent symbolize? The serpent described in the Bible was able to converse with people, able to communicate with human beings. This is not something normally that an animal literally can do. Furthermore, the serpent knew the will of God, which strictly forbade human beings to eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He said, did God say that you should not eat of this fruit, etc.? Oh, he was just trying to prevent you from becoming like him. So he knew God's will. This kind of a spiritual being, it's compelling evidence that this being was, the serpent symbolizes a spiritual being with the capacity to communicate, to know the will of God, etc. Now, Revelation 12:9 describes something more about this serpent. That great dragon, Revelation says, was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. It goes on, he was thrown down to the ground, and his angels were thrown down with him. So we have a being who's able to converse with human beings, who knows God's will, who has the wisdom and deceitfulness to tempt Adam and Eve, whose home was originally in heaven, had dominion over angels, and was cast down to the ground. We are left with the conclusion that the spiritual being represented by the serpent was not an animal, in fact, literally, but a symbol for Satan. What kind of spiritual being, even after it had fallen and become degraded to an evil being, could transcend time and space to dominate the human soul? There are no beings endowed with such characteristics other than angels. So this serpent who tempted human beings and sinned is an angelic being. Now please note, in 2 Peter 2:4, the Bible says that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into pits of nether gloom. Please remember that. Angels who sinned, cast into pits of nether gloom. The Bible also identifies a particular angelic being in Isaiah 14:12 as one who was originally in heaven, had dominion over angels, who tried to make himself like the Most High and fell down, was cast down. How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who made the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, above the stars of God. But you are brought down to hell, to the depths of the pit. Our conclusion is that the serpent who tempted Eve was an archangelic being, originally in the position closest to God, but was cast down as a result of his evil action and became Satan. Now let's consider the sin that caused the fall of the angel and compare it with the sin that caused the fall of Adam and Eve. First of all, the angelic sin. Jude chapter 1, verses 6 and 7 refers directly to the angels who sinned and were cast into pits of nether gloom. And it compares their sinful act to the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. Please read with me. From Jude 1, 6 to 7, we can infer that the angel fell as a result of an illicit sexual relationship. And the angels that did not keep their own position, but left their proper dwelling, have been kept by him in eternal chains in the nether gloom until the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise acted immorally and indulged in unnatural lust, serve as an example, etc., etc. Now, the Bible clearly means that Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities likewise acted as did the angels, indicating that the angelic sin was the sin of the misuse of God's precious ideal of love through an illicit sexual act or experience. Now let's consider the sin of Adam and Eve. From Genesis 3:7, we read that prior to the fall, Adam and Eve were both naked, but they were not ashamed. Was there any reason for them to be ashamed? Was there something wrong with their nose? Was there something wrong with their chin or belly button or knees? Nothing faulty and so no shame. However, after the fall, they did become ashamed. Let's look. After the fall, they felt ashamed of their nakedness and sewed fig leaves together into aprons to cover their lower parts. Now that's unusual. They didn't cover their mouths, which had eaten something, or their hands, which had stolen something. They felt compelled to cover their sexual areas. Now, just understanding human nature makes it clear to us where their guilt and shame was focused. As you can see, I'm a person that enjoys eating. And when I was young, my mother was very good at catching me in the cookie jar. I'd be going into the jar, my mother would walk in, or I'd have a mouthful of cookie. And when she did that, I might have put the cookie behind my back, covered my mouth. What are you doing? Mm-hmm. Have you been eating those cookies? Mm-mm. Are you telling me the truth? Mm-hmm. But there was never a time when my mother caught me eating something wrong when I did this. It doesn't make sense. Our understanding of human nature tells us their shame and their guilt was focused on their lower parts. Adam and Eve's sexual parts were the source of their shame because they were the instruments of their sinful deeds. Job 31:33, Job says, like Adam did, I too have covered my sin by hiding mine iniquity, concealed my transgression, he said, by hiding mine iniquity. What is it that Adam covered? Hence, we can deduce that if the angelic sin was an illicit sexual relationship, and the human sin was an illicit sexual relationship, that something must have occurred between the angel and human beings. Now remember, the serpent, representing the angel, tempted Eve to partake of the fruit, which represented what? It represented Eve's maturity or love on a tree that should have become ripe, but she was not yet given permission. The time was not yet ripe. The angel tempted Eve to partake of that fruit prematurely. Then Eve, in turn, tempted Adam to partake of that fruit. An illicit sexual relationship. Let's look more deeply now at the meaning of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What does the fruit represent? The fruit signifies the love of Eve. In the same way, as a tree grows to maturity, bears fruit, which in maturity contains healthy, ripened seeds, which become the basis of reproducing. So also, a human being in maturity is meant to multiply and reproduce through God-centered love and sexual relationship. So Eve's eating of the fruit denotes that she consummated a false or satanic love relationship with the angel, which bound her in a spiritual or even a blood connection to him, blood ties. That's the significance. Now Eve should have borne good children in maturity through her godly love. Instead, immature and self-centered love, through that she bore evil children through false love. So we can conclude then that the root of sin was not that the first human ancestors ate a literal fruit, but rather that they had a false, premature, self-centered relationship, misused love with an angel, symbolized by a serpent. Now there is a preponderance of evidence of this particular fact, that this is in fact the case. It's interesting to note that the tree they ate of was the tree of knowledge. And in the Bible, knowledge is not always meaning learning or understanding. When the Bible says that Adam knew Eve and she bore a child, Lot knew his wife and she bore a son, Cain knew his wife, the knowledge indicates intimate relationship, which in this case, mature and complete, is good. Premature and self-centered, evil. Also, they ate of a fruit, which is a common metaphor in today's Middle East and at the time of the Bible for an intimate relationship with the opposite sex, to eat or pick a fruit. But you can say, well, where's that in the Bible? Please study the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, which describes the relationship between newlywed lovers and uses eating the choicest fruits of my beloved, climbing her tree and picking the fruits that represent her body and her love, etc. So we can understand even biblically these are common metaphors used in this way. Also, we now can understand the significance of original sin, because eating a fruit wouldn't impact my descendants. But how is something passed from generation to generation? Through sexual relationship, sexual love. Also, we can consider that if we look at the Old Testament, the Jews were called by God to become his people. And he made a covenant with them that they should atone for their sin with equal payment, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, etc. And the sign of the covenant, the signature, was that every Jewish male child should be circumcised, cutting the foreskin, draining the blood. It was a spiritual rite in order to reconcile them to the position of God's children. Look in the New Testament, and we find that both Jesus and St. Paul advocated celibacy. Jesus said there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of God. And Paul said, it is good to be married, better than to burn in sin. But he who refrains from marriage does even better. Now, when God created man, he said, it is not fitting for man to be alone. And I will make him a helpmate fit for him. He said, be fruitful and multiply. So how is it that God's original intention for man and woman to be together can become something that both Jesus and Paul recommend you avoid if you want to serve God? The only possibility is that somehow that ideal of love had become defiled, corrupted, and misdirected. Sexual immorality has caused the downfall of kings, presidents, heroes, religious leaders, and the decline of civilization. When we look at the preponderance of sexual immorality, it's the one thing that even the advance of civilization cannot end, because it's a corruption that arises from the heart. Let's look then more deeply at the course